Sometimes a father's love looks like betrayal to the rest of the world. When your child is different, protecting them means making choices that break your own heart. Jarl Eirik faced this impossible decision when he gave his daughter Astrid to the cruel warlord Magnus Ironhand. His people called him weak. They said he traded his child for peace. Astrid was strong and spirited, but the warlord's men mocked her size and called her unworthy. Everyone thought she was doomed to suffer in Magnus's household. But Eirik had a secret plan. This marriage was never about surrender. He was placing his daughter right where she needed to be. Astrid would become his spy inside the enemy's home. Her supposed weakness would become her greatest strength. What happens when a father's dangerous gamble puts his daughter at the center of a deadly game? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Jarl Eirik Thornson stood at the edge of his ancestral lands, watching the gray waters that had carried his forefathers to glory. In his weathered hands, he held the bloodstone axe, its ancient steel reflecting the pale light of dawn. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather's grandfather, and every Thornson who had wielded it had faced moments that tested not just their strength, but their wisdom. Today would be such a day dot behind him. The settlement of Nordvik stirred to life with the familiar sounds that had comforted him since childhood. The lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the rhythmic strike of hammer on anvil from Olaf's smithy, the distant laughter of children playing by the shore. These were his people, and he had sworn before the gods to protect them. But protection sometimes demanded sacrifices that cut deeper than any blade. Father? The voice belonged to his daughter Astrid, and despite everything that weighed on his heart, Eirik smiled. She approached with the confident stride that had always set her apart, her thick braids swaying with each step. At 19, she stood, nearly as tall as most men, with shoulders broad from years of helping in the fields and arms strong from hauling nets full of fish. The other young women of the village had long since learned to hold their tongues about her size, especially after she'd outworked every one of them during the last harvest. "You're up early, my dear one," Eirik said, not turning from his contemplation of the waters. "The sun has barely kissed the mountains." Astrid moved to stand beside him, and he felt the familiar warmth of her presence. She had her mother's eyes, deep blue like the fjord in summer, and her mother's stubborn heart. "I couldn't sleep. The whole village is talking about Magnus Ironhand's message." The name hung between them like a curse. Magnus Ironhand, the self-styled warlord who had carved a bloody path through 3 neighboring territories, leaving burned settlements and broken families in his wake. His fortress, Ironhold, squatted like a stone spider on the mountainside 2 days' ride to the north. And from there he had sent increasingly aggressive demands for tribute. "What are they saying?" Eirik asked, though he already knew. "That you should refuse him, that we should fight." Astrid's voice carried the fire that had always burned within her, the same flame that had driven her mother to stand against impossible odds. "Bjorn says our warriors are ready. Old Henrik claims his sons would rather die with honor than live as Magnus's subjects." Bjorn Ravenclaw had been Eirik's closest advisor for 20 years, a man whose wisdom in war was matched only by his loyalty. If Bjorn thought they could win a direct confrontation with Magnus, it meant their position was stronger than Eirik had dared hope. But strength alone would not save his people from what was coming. "And what do you say, Astrid?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying her father's profile. She had inherited his thoughtful nature along with her mother's passion, and Eirik had spent years teaching her to look beyond the obvious answers. "I say that Magnus didn't become the terror of the northern territories by being stupid. If he's pressing us now, it's because he believes he can win. But you've been planning something, haven't you? You have that look you get when you're 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Pride swelled in Eirik's chest. His daughter saw clearly, even when others were blinded by righteous anger. Tell me what you know about Magnus Ironhand. He's cruel and ambitious. He rules through fear and has no mercy for those who oppose him. His men are well trained, but not particularly loyal. They follow him because he wins, not because they love him. Astrid paused, her brow furrowing. Why do you ask? Because knowing your enemy is the first step to defeating him. Eirik finally turned to face his daughter fully. In the growing light, he could see the worry lines around her eyes, the way her hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. She was bracing for bad news, and he hated that he was about to give it to her. From the settlement behind them came the sound of approaching footsteps, and Eirik recognized Bjorn's measured gait. The older man appeared through the morning mist, his graying beard braided with iron rings that marked his status as a warrior of renown. Behind him walked Ingrid, Astrid's dearest friend and the closest thing to a sister she had ever known. "My lord," Bjorn said with a respectful nod, "the council awaits your word." Magnus's messenger grows impatient. Eirik had been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since Magnus's demands had arrived sealed in black wax. The warlord wanted tribute, but not in silver or cattle. He wanted something more personal, more degrading. He wanted a wife from among the noble families of the region, and he had specifically requested Eirik's daughter. "Astrid," Eirik said softly, "what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to understand. I need you to trust that everything I do for love of you and love of our people." The young woman's face went pale, but her chin lifted with characteristic defiance. "Tell me, Magnus Ironhand has demanded tribute. Not gold or grain, but a bride. He wants to marry you, and if I refuse, he will bring his full war band against us. We might hold our walls for a time, but our people will suffer. Children will starve. Good men will die." Ingrid gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Astrid, however, remained still as carved stone. "And you're considering giving me to him?" "I am doing more than considering it," Eirik said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. I have already agreed." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant cry of seabirds and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. Astrid stared at her father as if seeing a stranger, and Eirik felt his heart crack down the middle. "How could you?" Ingrid whispered, "Astrid is your daughter, your only child. How could you give her to that monster?" Bjorn stepped forward, his face troubled. "My lord, perhaps there is another way." "There is no other way," Eirik said firmly. Magnus's messenger made that clear. He will accept Astrid as his bride, or he will take our lands by force and make slaves of our survivors. Astrid found her voice at last. "So that's it? I'm to be sacrificed for the good of the village." Her words were edged with pain and something that might have been betrayal. "No," Eirik said, and now he allowed some of the steel beneath his careful words to show. "You are to be our salvation." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When he unfolded it, the morning light caught the silver of an intricate locket, no larger than a child's palm. It bore the likeness of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Astrid's mother, captured in miniature by a skilled artisan years before her death. "Your mother gave this to me the day you were born," Eirik said, placing the locket in Astrid's palm. "She told me that someday you would face a choice between safety and courage, and that when that day came, I should trust in the strength she had given you." Astrid's fingers closed around the locket, and for a moment she looked very young. "I don't understand." "Magnus Ironhand is powerful because he inspires fear, but fear makes a man vulnerable to those who appear harmless. You will go to him not as a sacrifice, but as a weapon. You will be my eyes and ears in his household. You will learn his weaknesses, Discover his secrets, and when the time is right, you will help me bring him down." The weight of understanding settled over Astrid's features like the dawn settling over the mountains. "You want me to be a spy. I want you to be what you have always been: clever, observant, and far stronger than anyone gives you credit for." Eirik stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Magnus's men mock you already, calling you unworthy of their lord's attention. Let them think you weak and frightened. Let them underestimate you completely. While they see only a fat girl who trembles in corners, you will be gathering the intelligence we need to destroy them all." Bjorn's eyes widened with understanding. The servant who hears everything but is noticed by no one. Exactly. Eirik looked between his daughter and his oldest friend. Magnus rules through cruelty and intimidation, but his own men fear him as much as his enemies do. Fear breeds resentment, and resentment breeds opportunity. Astrid will find those opportunities. Ingrid shook her head in dismay. "But the danger, my lord. If Magnus discovers what she's doing, he will kill her." Eirik finished. "I know. That's why this plan requires something more precious than courage. It requires trust between a father and daughter who have never lied to each other." Astrid was quiet for a long time, her thumb tracing the edges of her mother's locket. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "How long would I have to stay with him? As long as it takes. Weeks, perhaps months. You will send word through trusted merchants who travel the trade routes. When we have enough information about his defenses, his allies, and his plans, we will act. And if something goes wrong? If I'm discovered before then?" Eirik's jaw tightened. "Then I will tear down his fortress with my bare hands to reach you." For the first time since this conversation began, Astrid smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it carried echoes of her mother's courage. "You know this will destroy your reputation. The people will call you weak, a coward who sold his daughter for peace." "Let them," Eirik said simply. "History will remember the truth, even if the present does not." Astrid nodded slowly. "When does Magnus expect his answer?" "Today. His messenger waits in the great hall." "Then we should not keep him waiting." She fastened her mother's locket around her neck, where it disappeared beneath the rough wool of her dress. "But father, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, when Magnus is defeated and our people are safe, you will never ask me to marry for politics again. The next man I wed will be one I choose for love." Despite everything, Eirik found himself chuckling. "I promise. Though knowing you, you'll probably choose some impossible romantic who writes poetry and has never held a sword." "Maybe I will," Astrid said, and for a moment she sounded like the carefree girl she had been before the weight of adulthood and responsibility had settled on her shoulders. "Or maybe I'll decide I prefer the company of books to the company of men." Bjorn cleared his throat diplomatically. "My lord, the messenger ... Yes, of course." Eirik straightened, transforming from loving father back into the Jarl his people expected him to be. "Astrid, return to the settlement and prepare yourself. Take only what you can carry easily, and nothing that might seem too valuable. Remember, you are to appear as a reluctant bride, not a willing spy." "I understand." Astrid embraced her father tightly, and for a moment they were just a man and his daughter facing an uncertain future together. "I love you, father. And I love you, my brave girl, more than you will ever know." As they walked back toward the settlement, the sun climbed higher over the fjord, burning away the morning mist and revealing the day in all its clarity. Behind them, the ancient waters continued their eternal rhythm, carrying the hopes and fears of one generation to the next, just as they had for Eirik's ancestors and would for his descendants yet to come. The Great Hall of Norvik had seen many momentous occasions throughout the generations, but none quite like this. Eirik sat in his carved oak chair, the bloodstone axe resting across his knees. while Magnus Ironhand's messenger stood before him with barely concealed impatience. The man was typical of his master's servants, scarred, brutal, and radiating. The casual violence of one accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. "Well?" the messenger demanded. His name was Grimmer, and he wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. "My lord grows tired of waiting for your answer, Thornton." Around the hall, the village elders and warriors had gathered to witness this exchange. Their faces showed a mixture of anger and confusion, for they had expected their Jarl to deliver a defiant refusal. Instead, Eirik appeared to be considering capitulation, and their respect was turning to bewilderment with each passing moment. "Tell your master," Eirik said slowly, "that I accept his proposal. My daughter will become his wife." The words fell into the hall like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread to every corner. Old Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with disbelief. "My lord, you cannot mean this." "Astrid is. The decision is made," Eirik said with finality. "Grimmer, you may tell Magnus Ironhand that his bride will be ready to travel within the hour." The messenger's lips curved into a cruel smile. "My lord will be pleased. He has heard interesting things about your daughters. Generous proportions. He looks forward to seeing if the rumors are true." Several of the younger warriors moved restlessly at this insult, hands drifting toward sword hilts, but Eirik's sharp glance kept them in check. He had learned long ago that sometimes the hardest battles were won by swallowing pride rather than drawing steel. "Where is she?" Grimmer continued. "I would see this bride for myself." As if summoned by his words, Astrid entered the hall. She had changed from her simple mourning dress into her finest gown, a deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread that had belonged to her mother. Her thick blonde hair was braided with ribbons, and she carried herself with the dignity that had always made her father proud. Yet Eirik could see the fear she was trying so hard to hide, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of a young woman facing the unknown. Grimmer looked her up and down with the appraising eye of a man evaluating livestock. "She's large enough. I'll grant you that. My lord prefers his women with meat on their bones." He circled her slowly, and Astrid stood perfectly still, though Eirik could see the muscle in her jaw tightening. "Turn around, girl. Let me see what Magnus is getting for his mercy." "That's enough," Bjorn growled, but Astrid raised a hand to stop him. "It's all right," she said quietly. She completed the humiliating turn, and Grimmer nodded with satisfaction. "She do. My lord has always enjoyed breaking spirited fillies to his will." The messenger's laugh was like the rasp of steel on stone. "Gather your things, girl. We leave immediately." Astrid had prepared a small leather satchel with her few precious possessions, a few changes of clothing, her mother's comb, and a small eating knife that had been her grandmother's. She had deliberately chosen items that would seem unremarkable to casual inspection, though each had been selected for its potential usefulness in the trials ahead. As she shouldered her pack, the hall erupted in angry voices. Eirik Redbeard, one of the village's most respected warriors, stepped forward with fury written across his scarred features. "This is madness, Jarl Eirik. You condemn your own daughter to a life of misery for what? A few seasons of peace? Magnus, we'll tire of this game eventually and come for us anyway." "Aye," shouted another voice. "What manner of father trades his child to a wolf?" The condemnation spread through the crowd like wildfire. These were people who had followed Eirik through lean harvests and harsh winters, who had trusted his judgment in matters both large and small. To see him apparently abandon his principles for the sake of temporary safety was a betrayal they struggled to understand. "You shame us all," old Henrik said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your father would weep to see this day." Each word struck Eirik like a physical blow, but he bore them in silence. This was the price of his deception, and he would pay it gladly if it meant protecting both his daughter and his people. Only Bjorn understood the true weight of what was happening, and even he looked troubled by the performance they were all forced to give. "Enough," Eirik said finally, rising from his chair. The hall fell silent, awaiting his words. "I am still your Jarl, and I have made my decision. Magnus Ironhand will have his bride, and Norvik will have its peace." He walked to where Astrid stood and placed his hands on her shoulders. To the watching crowd, it might have looked like a father's final blessing. In reality, it was something far more precious, a father's trust in his daughter's strength and courage. "Remember the old stories," he said softly, repeating the words he had spoken that morning. To anyone listening, it would sound like comfort for a frightened girl. To Astrid, it was the activation of their plan. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will not forget." Grimmer was already moving toward the door, eager to begin the journey back to his master. "Come then, girl. Magnus Ironhand does not like to be kept waiting, and the road to Ironhold is long." The procession that formed outside the great hall was unlike any wedding party the village had ever seen. Grimmer and his half-dozen companions were mounted on sturdy ponies, their weapons and armor glinting dully in the afternoon sun. They had brought a gentle mar for Astrid, a grudging concession to her status as their lord's intended bride. As Astrid mounted her horse, the villagers who had gathered to witness her departure fell into an uncomfortable silence. Children stared with wide eyes, not understanding why their friend was leaving with these frightening strangers. Women wept openly for a girl they feared would never return. The men stood rigid with suppressed anger, their hands clenched into futile fists. Ingrid pushed through the crowd and ran to Astrid's side. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't go. We'll find another way." Astrid leaned down and embraced her dearest friend. "Take care of father for me," she said. "And remember what I told you about the winter stores. Make sure old Nora gets her share." It was a mundane concern, the kind of practical matter that Astrid had always attended to with quiet efficiency. But it was also her way of saying goodbye to the life she had known, of ensuring that her responsibilities would be fulfilled even in her absence. Grimmer spurred his horse toward the village gates, and the rest of the party fell in around Astrid. As they began to move, she turned back for one last look at her home. Her father stood in the doorway of the great hall, his face carved from stone, giving no sign of the pain that Astrid knew must be tearing him apart. The ride to Ironhold would take 2 days, following ancient paths that wound through the mountains like scars across the landscape. As they climbed higher into the peaks, leaving the familiar fjord behind, Astrid felt the weight of her mission settling around her like a cloak. She was no longer Astrid Eirik's daughter, beloved daughter of a respected Jarl. She was now a tool of war, a weapon disguised as a victim. The countryside they passed through told the story of Magnus Ironhand's rise to power. Burned farmsteads dotted the valleys like blackened teeth, their owners either dead or fled to seek shelter elsewhere. The few travelers they encountered on the road took one look at Grim's warband and melted into the forest like shadows. "Your new home has quite a reputation," one of Grimmer's men commented to Astrid as they made camp for the night. His name was Ulf, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in frightening their prisoner. "Magnus likes his guests to feel welcome, so he decorates the approach with the heads of those who displease him." Astrid forced herself to remain calm. "I'm sure my lord husband will treat his wife with more consideration than he shows his enemies." Ulf laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, you poor simple girl. You think being his wife will protect you? Magnus has had 3 wives already. Would you like to know what happened to them?" "Leave her be, Ulf," Grimmer said sharply. "Magnus wants her delivered intact, not mad with terror." But the damage was done. As they settled down for the night, Astrid lay awake staring at the stars and thinking about the women who had come before her. What had become of them? Had they tried to resist Magnus's cruelty, or had they simply endured until death claimed them? She touched her mother's locket beneath her dress, drawing strength from the memory of a woman who had never backed down from a fight. The second day of travel brought them within sight of Ironhold, and Astrid felt her breath catch in her throat. The fortress squatted on a rocky outcrop like some monstrous beast, its black stone walls seeming to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Banners bearing Magnus's wolf sigil snapped in the mountain wind, and smoke rose from dozens of chimneys within the walls. "Home sweet home," Grimr said with mock cheerfulness. "I do hope you'll be happy here, my lady." As they approached the massive gates, Astrid could see guards watching from the walls. Their faces showed the hard indifference of men who had seen too much violence to be moved by one more victim being delivered to their master. The gates swung open with a groan of protesting iron, and suddenly Astrid was inside the enemy's stronghold. The courtyard was a hive of activity. Warriors practiced with sword and spear in one corner, while servants hurried about their duties in another. The air smelled of horses, leather, and something else, something that made Astrid's skin crawl even, though she couldn't identify it. It was the smell of a place where suffering had become commonplace, where cruelty was the coin of daily exchange. "Take her to the Lord's Hall," Grimr commanded one of the servants. "Magnus will want to inspect his prize immediately." As Astrid was led across the courtyard, she forced herself to observe everything. The layout of the buildings, the number of guards, the locations of the gates and sally ports, all of it would be valuable intelligence for her father when the time came. But she also noticed something else: the way the servants avoided eye contact, the nervous way the guards held their weapons, the general atmosphere of barely suppressed fear that permeated the entire place. Magnus Ironhand ruled through terror, just as she had expected, but terror was a double-edged sword, and Astrid was already beginning to see how it might be turned against him. The Great Hall of Ironhold was a monument to Magnus Ironhand's vanity and cruelty. Tapestries depicting his victories covered the stone walls, each one showing scenes of conquest rendered in vivid detail. Weapons taken from defeated enemies hung between the tapestries like trophies, their steel still stained with the blood of former owners. At the far end of the hall, Magnus himself sat upon a throne carved from the trunk of an ancient oak, its surface decorated with iron bands that gleamed like chains in the firelight. Magnus Ironhand was not what Astrid had expected. She had imagined a giant of a man, someone whose physical presence matched his fearsome reputation. Instead, she found herself facing a man of average height and lean build, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, and his pale eyes holding the cold intelligence of a predator. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, giving his face a perpetual sneer that made him appear both cruel and calculating. "So," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall despite its conversational tone, "this is Eirik, Thornson's precious daughter." He rose from his throne and began walking toward her with the measured pace of a man who enjoyed making others wait. "The stories I've heard are most amusing. They say you're as broad as a barn door and twice as sturdy." Several of his men laughed at this, the sound echoing off the stone walls like the baying of hounds. Astrid kept her eyes fixed on the floor, playing the part of a frightened maiden while her mind catalogued every detail of her surroundings. She counted at least 20 warriors in the hall, all of them well-armed and bearing the casual arrogance of men who had never known defeat. But she also noticed the servants who lurked in the shadows along the walls, and the way their faces showed sympathy rather than amusement at her predicament. Magnus stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "Look at me when I speak to you, girl. You are in my house now, and you will learn proper respect." Astrid raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment they measured each other in silence. Magnus saw what he expected to see: a young woman intimidated, by her circumstances, trying to hide her fear behind a mask of dignity. What he failed to notice was the intelligence in her gaze, the way she took note of everything around her while appearing to focus solely on him. "Better," Magnus said with approval. "Now then, let me make something clear from the start. You are here because your father lacks the courage to face me in honest battle. He has given you to me like a peace offering, hoping to buy time for his pathetic little settlement. Do you understand this?" "Yes, my lord," Astrid replied quietly. "Good. And do you know what I do with peace offerings that disappoint me?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Astrid lowered her eyes again, letting her shoulders tremble slightly as if the implications were just now sinking in. "No, my lord." Magnus gestured toward one of the weapon displays on the wall. "That axe there belonged to Jarl Thorvald the Bold. He thought he could negotiate with me too. Would you like to know where Thorvald is now?" "My lord will tell me if it pleases him," Astrid whispered. "His head decorates a spike outside my gates, and his wife tends my pigs." Magnus's smile was like winter frost. "So you see, my dear Astrid, your value to me depends entirely on your youthfulness. As long as you please me, you will be treated as befits my bride. Disappoint me, and you will discover that there are fates worse than death." He began circling her again, and Astrid remained perfectly still. This was a test, she realized, a way for Magnus to establish dominance from their very first meeting. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to show him that she was not some helpless victim to be intimidated. But her father's plan required her to appear weak and frightened, at least until she could find her footing in this dangerous place. "The wedding will take place in 3 days," Magnus announced. "That should give you time to make yourself presentable. I have standards, after all." He paused directly behind her, his breath warm against her neck. "But first, let me show you something that will help you understand your situation." He clapped his hands twice, and a side door opened to admit 2 servants carrying a large iron cauldron between them. The pot was ancient and well used, its surface blackened by countless fires and its rim worn smooth by generations of hands. They set it down carefully in the center of the hall, where it caught and reflected the firelight like a dark mirror. "This belonged to my grandmother," Magnus said conversationally. "She was a formidable woman, known throughout the region for her skill in both cooking and witchcraft. When she died, she left me this pot along with some very specific instructions about its use." Astrid stared at the cauldron with growing unease. There was something unsettling about it, something that seemed to radiate an aura of old pain and darker purposes. She could see symbols carved around its rim, runes that spoke of binding and control. "You see, my dear Astrid, I have learned that the best way to ensure loyalty is to give people something meaningful to lose. This pot has a very special property. It reveals truth. When someone drinks from it, they cannot lie for a full day afterward. More importantly, they cannot act against my interests during that time." Magnus nodded to one of his servants, who began ladling a dark liquid from a smaller vessel into the cauldron. The smell that rose from the mixture was herbal and bitter, with undertones of something Astrid couldn't identify, but that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. "Every person who serves in my household drinks from this pot," Magnus continued. "Warriors, servants, advisors, everyone. It's a simple precaution that has saved me from numerous assassination attempts over the years." Now Astrid understood. The cauldron wasn't just a symbol of Magnus's power, it was a tool of control. Whatever that dark liquid contained, it would make her vulnerable to him in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. If she drank from it, her mission would be over before it truly began. "However," Magnus said, and his tone became almost gentle, "I'm willing to make an exception for you. After all, you are to be my wife, not my servant. The choice is yours. Drink willingly and accept the protection that comes with complete honesty." or refuse and be treated as a potential enemy. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the fires. Every eye was fixed on Astrid, waiting to see how she would respond. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. This was the first real test of her mission, and how she handled it would determine everything that followed. "My lord," she said carefully, "I am but a simple maiden who knows nothing of war or intrigue. My father sent me here to be your wife, and I have no wish to be anything else. If drinking from your grandmother's pot will prove my sincerity, then I will do so gladly." It was a calculated risk. By appearing eager to comply, she might convince Magnus that she posed no threat. But she also knew that whatever was in that cauldron could destroy her ability to carry out her father's plan. Magnus studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he smiled, not the cruel smile he had worn earlier, but something that might almost have passed for genuine warmth. "An interesting answer," he said, "but unnecessary. I can see that you are exactly what you appear to be, a frightened girl who wants nothing more than to survive her circumstances. The pot is for those who might pose a genuine threat, and you, my dear Astrid, are clearly not among them." Relief flooded through Astrid, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. Magnus's arrogance had just given her the opening she needed. By dismissing her as harmless, he had handed her the perfect disguise. "Take her to the women's quarters," Magnus commanded. "See that she's given suitable clothing and whatever else she needs to prepare for our wedding. And remember, she is to be treated with the respect due my future wife." As servants stepped forward to escort her from the hall, Astrid caught sight of an elderly man standing near the kitchen entrance. He was watching her with interest rather than indifference, and when their eyes met briefly, she saw something unexpected in his gaze. Understanding. This man, whoever he was, had recognized something in her that the others had missed. The women's quarters were located in a separate wing of the fortress, connected to the main structure by a covered walkway. As they walked, one of the servant women, a middle-aged woman named Helga, spoke quietly to Astrid. "Don't mind his lordship's manner, dearie. He likes to frighten new arrivals, but he's not as terrible as he pretends to be." The words were meant to be comforting, but Astrid could hear the forced cheerfulness in them, the desperate need to believe that their master wasn't quite as monstrous as he appeared. The chamber they gave her was larger and more comfortable than she had expected, with a proper bed, a washstand, and even a small window that looked out over the courtyard. It was clearly meant for someone of status, not a prisoner or a victim. Magnus was playing a careful game, presenting himself as a reasonable man who honored his agreements, at least when it suited his purposes. That night, as Astrid lay in her unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the fortress settling around her, she began to plan. The Iron Cauldron had shown her something important about Magnus's methods. He relied on control through fear and magical compulsion, but he also had blind spots. His arrogance made him dismiss potential threats that didn't fit his expectations, and that arrogance would be his downfall. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of her mission. She would find the old man who had watched her with such interest, discover the fortress's secrets, and start building the intelligence network her father would need to bring Magnus down. Dawn came early to Ironhold, announced by the harsh clanging of a bell that echoed off the fortress walls like a call to battle. Astrid woke with a start, momentarily forgetting where she was before the reality of her situation came flooding back. Through her small window, she could see the courtyard already bustling with activity as servants began their daily routines, and guards changed shifts along the walls. A soft knock at her door preceded the entrance of Helga, the servant woman who had escorted her the night before. She carried a basin of warm water and fresh linens, along with a simple dress of brown wool that would mark Astrid as part of the household staff rather than a noble guest. "Good morning, my lady," Helga said quietly. "His lordship requests that You joined the household for the morning meal. He thought you might prefer to eat in the kitchens rather than the great hall, at least until you're more comfortable with your new surroundings. It was presented as a kindness, but Astrid recognized it for what it truly was, an opportunity to observe the fortress's daily operations without appearing to do so deliberately. Magnus's dismissal of her as a threat was already proving useful. "That's very thoughtful of Lord Magnus," Astrid replied, accepting the simple dress. "I confess I would feel more at ease among the servants for now." As she dressed, Astrid carefully pinned a small raven brooch that had belonged to her grandmother to the inside of her sleeve. The piece was unremarkable enough to escape notice, but its sharp pin could serve multiple purposes if needed. More importantly, she had decided to use it as a way to mark any messages she might need to send. A small scratch from the pin would identify correspondence from her to those who knew to look for it. The kitchens of Ironhold were a world unto themselves, warm and humid from the constant fires and filled with the organized chaos of preparing meals for several hundred people. The elderly man Astrid had noticed the night before stood at the center of it all, directing the work with the quiet authority of someone who had mastered his craft over decades of service. "So you're the new bride," he said when Helga brought Astrid to him. His voice was gravelly but not unkind, and his eyes held the same sharp intelligence she had glimpsed the night before. "I'm Henrik, head cook of this establishment. Been stirring pots and keeping secrets for more years than I care to count." "I'm Astrid," she replied, offering a respectful curtsy. "I was hoping I might be useful here. I have some experience with cooking and household management." Henrik studied her with the appraising eye of a craftsman evaluating a new apprentice. "Can you knead bread without making it tough? Can you season a stew without instructions? Can you keep your mouth shut when you hear things that aren't meant for your ears?" "Yes, to all three," Astrid said firmly. "Good. Then you can start by helping young Sven there with the morning porridge. The lad means well, but he has a tendency to let it burn when he gets distracted." Sven turned out to be a boy of perhaps 16, with the gangly build of someone still growing into his adult frame. His face lit up with relief when Astrid took over stirring the large pot of oats and barley that would feed the servants' table. "Thank you," he whispered. "Henrik gets fierce when the porridge burns, and I was sure I was about to ruin it again." "What distracts you?" Astrid asked, keeping her voice low as she worked. "The horses," Sven admitted. "I help in the stables when I'm not needed here, and I can hear them from the courtyard. When something spooks them, I can't help but wonder what's happening." It was an innocent comment, but it told Astrid something important about the fortress's rhythms. The horses would react to unusual activity, late-night visitors, preparations for raids, anything that disrupted the normal routine. A stable boy who paid attention to such things could be a valuable source of information. "I've always loved horses," Astrid said casually. "Perhaps you could show me the stable sometime when your duties permit." Over the next hour, as the kitchens prepared the morning meal, Astrid began to understand the complex social structure of Magnus's household. There were the warriors, who ate in the great hall and treated the servants with casual disdain. There were the household servants like Henrik and Helga, who had been with Magnus long enough to understand his moods and preferences. And there were the newer arrivals, people from conquered territories, who had been absorbed into the household, and who moved through their duties with the careful wariness of those who had not yet learned to trust their new master Dodd. It was among this last group that Astrid sensed the greatest potential for recruitment. These were people who remembered freedom, who had lost family and friends to Magnus's ambitions. They served him out of necessity rather than loyalty, and that made them potential allies if approached carefully. When the morning meal was served, Astrid found herself seated at the servants' table with a bowl of the porridge she had helped prepare, along with hard cheese and brown bread still warm from the ovens. The conversation around her was muted but revealing complaints about a leaking roof in the eastern tower, speculation about the weather and its effect on the mountain passes, casual gossip about which of Magnus's warriors was favoring which of the serving girls. But Henrik spoke little, content to observe the dynamics around him while methodically working through his own meal. When most of the others had finished and returned to their duties, he gestured for Astrid to remain seated. "You're not what you seem," he said without preamble. Most noble-born girls would be weeping into their porridge by now, not asking about stable duties and watching everything with those sharp eyes of yours. Astrid felt her heart skip, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just trying to make the best of my circumstances." That's exactly what you're doing. But most people in your situation would be trying to make the best of it by winning Magnus's favor, not by learning the layout of his kitchens. Henrik leaned back, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your father has a reputation as a clever man. I'm beginning to wonder if that cleverness runs in the family." The old cook was far more perceptive than Astrid had hoped, but perhaps that perception could be turned to her advantage. "What do you know about my father?" "I know he's held his lands for 20 years without bending the knee to every ambitious warlord who came calling. I know he's managed to keep his people fed through bad harvests and harsh winters. And I know he's not the type of man to give up his only daughter without a very good reason." Henrik stood and began clearing the table, his movements efficient, despite his age. "I also know that Magnus has enemies both within these walls and beyond them. The question is whether you're here to find those enemies or to become one of them." It was a moment of decision, and Astrid knew that her answer would shape everything that followed. Henrik was offering her something, his knowledge, his assistance, perhaps even his active help. But accepting that offer would mean revealing her true purpose to someone she had known for less than a day. She thought of her father's words about trust being the most precious currency in a dangerous game. Sometimes survival required taking calculated risks, and Henrik's years of service in this place made him invaluable as an ally. "I'm here to learn," she said carefully, "and perhaps to remember what I learned for a time when that knowledge might prove useful." Henrik nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." "Well then, you'll need to understand more than just how to stir porridge without burning it. This fortress has secrets that could bring down kingdoms if they fell into the right hands." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that explain why Magnus's enemies keep disappearing before they can become real threats to him. The kind that would tell you who really holds the power in this place, and it's not always the man sitting on the throne." Henrik's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Meet me in the root cellar after the evening meal. There's something you need to see." As if their conversation had been about nothing more than kitchen duties, Henrik raised his voice to a normal level. "Now then, if you're to be useful around here, you'll need to learn where everything belongs. Sven can show you the pantries and storage rooms while I prepare for the midday meal." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mundane tasks that served as perfect cover for Astrid's real purpose. Under Sven's eager guidance, she explored the fortress's service areas, noting the location of storage rooms, guard posts, and the various passages that connected different sections of the complex. The stable boy's enthusiasm for showing off his knowledge made him an unwitting guide to information that would have taken her days to gather on her own. The stables themselves were impressive, housing nearly 50 horses ranging from sturdy mountain ponies to expensive war horses that spoke of Magnus's success in battle. Sven introduced her to each animal with the fond familiarity of someone who genuinely loved his work, and Astrid made mental notes about which horses would be fastest for escape or message carrying should the need arise. "That one there is Magnus's personal mount," Sven said, pointing to a magnificent black stallion in the largest stall. "Shadowmane, he calls him. The beast's as mean-tempered as his master, but he's the fastest horse I've ever seen." "How often does Magnus ride out?" Astrid asked casually. "Not as often as he used to. Mostly just for hunts now, or when he needs to visit one of his other holdings. He's been spending more time in meetings lately, talking with visitors who come and go at strange hours. More valuable intelligence. Magnus was clearly involved in negotiations or planning of some kind, and the irregular schedule of his visitors suggested secrecy. These were the kinds of details her father would need to understand Magnus's current activities and future plans. By the time evening arrived, Astrid had already learned more about Ironhold's operations than she had dared hope for in her first full day. But Henrik's promise of deeper secrets waited in the root cellar, and she found herself both eager and apprehensive about what he might reveal. The root cellar lay beneath the kitchens, accessible by a narrow stone stairway that led down into the cool darkness beneath the fortress. When Astrid descended at the appointed time, she found Henrik waiting for her among the sacks of grain and barrels of preserved foods that would see the household through the winter months. "What I'm about to show you," he said without preamble, "cost 2 good men their lives to learn. They died thinking the knowledge would die with them. But death has a way of keeping secrets poorly in a place like this." He led her to what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the far end of the cellar. But when he pressed against a particular stone, a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond lay a narrow passage that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the mountain. "Magnus didn't build Ironhold," Henrik explained as they entered the hidden passage. "He conquered it from a family that had held it for 300 years. They knew things about this place that he's never discovered, and some of us who served them before have kept that knowledge alive." The passage opened into a small chamber carved from the living rock, and in the center of that chamber sat an ornate chest bound with iron and sealed with a lock that bore the same raven symbol as Astrid's hidden brooch. Henrik produced a key from beneath his shirt and opened the chest to reveal its contents: scrolls of parchment covered in detailed writing, maps of the surrounding territories, and what appeared to be correspondence between various noble houses. The previous lord was a careful man who believed in keeping records of everything, Henrik said. Magnus has spent years looking for these documents because they contain proof of his crimes, not just the obvious ones like murder and theft, but the secret agreements he made with enemies of the crown, the bribes he paid to corrupt officials, the treacheries that bought him his position. Astrid stared at the treasure trove of intelligence before her. This was more than she had dared hope for, not just information about Magnus's current activities, but documented evidence of his past crimes that could be used to turn his own allies against him. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because I'm old, and I'm tired of serving a man I despise. Because those 2 men who died for this knowledge were my friends, and they deserved better. And because I think your father might be the key to finally bringing justice to this cursed place." Henrik closed the chest and locked it again. "You can't take any of this with you, not yet. But you can read it, memorize what's important, and find ways to get that information to those who can use it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Astrid said without hesitation. "I can do that." As they made their way back through the hidden passage, Astrid felt the weight of her mission shifting and expanding. She had come to Ironhold expecting to gather basic intelligence about Magnus's defenses and plans. Instead, she had found the means to destroy him completely, along with an ally who understood the stakes as well as she did. The game had changed, and she intended to win it. 3 weeks had passed since Astrid's arrival at Ironhold, and the rhythms of fortress life had become as familiar to her as breathing. Each morning she rose before dawn to help Henrik in the kitchens, spending her days learning not just the art of feeding hundreds of people, but the more delicate skill of listening to conversations that weren't meant for her ears. Each evening she descended to the hidden chamber beneath the cellars, where she methodically worked her way through the treasure trove of documents that detailed Magnus's crimes and connections. The wedding had been postponed twice. First, due to Magnus's sudden departure to deal with a territorial dispute, then because of what he described as more pressing matters of state. Astrid suspected the delays were deliberate. Magnus was the sort of man who enjoyed keeping people off balance, and the uncertainty surrounding her future status served his purpose as well. She remained in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor bride. Neither servant nor noble guest thought it was during this period of waiting that she met Thorvald. She first noticed him during the evening meal in the great hall, where she had begun taking her food after Magnus insisted she join the proper company rather than eating with the kitchen staff. He sat at one of the lower tables reserved for warriors of middle rank, a man of perhaps 30 years with dark hair and thoughtful gray eyes that seemed out of place among Magnus's typically brutal followers. Unlike the others, Thorvald didn't participate in the crude jokes and boastful stories that usually dominated such gatherings. Instead, he ate in contemplative silence, occasionally glancing around the hall with an expression that Astrid had learned to recognize, the look of someone who was present in body, but whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. What caught her attention most was the way he watched Magnus. While the other warriors showed either fear or fawning admiration when they looked at their lord, Thorvald's gaze held something different. There was assessment there, and calculation, and perhaps even a hint of barely concealed contempt. Their first direct encounter came by accident, or what she chose to believe was accident. She was returning from the stables, where she had been learning the horses' names and temperaments from Sven, when she rounded a corner and collided with someone carrying an armload of weapons that clattered to the stone floor with a sound like falling thunder. "My pardon," Thorvald said, immediately kneeling to gather the scattered swords and axes. "I should have been more careful." "The fault was mine," Astrid replied, bending to help him collect the weapons, as she handed him a particularly fine sword with silver inlay on its hilt. Their fingers brushed, and she felt them press something small and hard into her palm. "I was distracted by my own thoughts." "Dangerous habit in a place like this, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. "Thoughts can lead to questions, and questions can lead to trouble." The object in her palm was smooth and cool, a small piece of carved bone in the shape of a raven. As Thorvald gathered the last of his weapons and continued on his way, Astrid slipped the carving into her sleeve next to her grandmother's brooch, her heart racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Someone else in Magnus's household was playing a deeper game. That night, she examined the bone carving by candlelight in her chamber. It was exquisitely crafted, with tiny runes carved along its wings that she recognized as symbols of memory and truth. More importantly, when she turned it over, she found a message scratched in barely visible letters. "The old gods remember. Do you?" It was a phrase from an ancient song her father had taught her, one that spoke of justice delayed but never forgotten. Someone in Ironhold knew far more about her than they should, and that someone was reaching out to her with the kind of coded message that could only come from an ally or an extremely clever enemy. The next morning brought news that sent ripples of excitement through the fortress. A messenger had arrived during the night with word that Jarl Eirik Bloodaxe of the Eastern Territories had agreed to meet with Magnus to discuss an alliance. The meeting would take place in neutral territory, but Magnus would be taking a significant portion of his war band with him as both escort and demonstration of strength. 30 of his best warriors, Henrik murmured to Astrid as they prepared the midday meal, including most of his personal guard. He's either very confident in this alliance or very paranoid about leaving the fortress undermanned. How long will he be gone? Astrid asked, trying to keep her voice casual. At least a week, perhaps 2 if the negotiations prove complicated. long enough for certain conversations to take place without fear of interruption. That afternoon, as the great hall buzzed with preparations for Magnus's departure, Astrid found herself approached by one of the serving women, a Pate Evine and a young mother named Brenna, whose husband had been killed in Magnus's service the previous year. "Begging your pardon, my lady," Brenna said nervously, "but there's someone who wishes to speak with you. Someone who knew your mother." The words hit Astrid like a physical blow. Her mother had died when she was barely 10 years old, and she had never heard anyone at Ironhold mention knowing her. "Who? Best you hear it from him directly. They'll be waiting in the chapel after the evening prayers, when most folk have returned to their duties." The chapel of Ironhold was a small, austere chamber that had been added to the fortress as an afterthought. Magnus paid lip service to the new Christian faith when it suited his political purposes, but the old gods still held sway in the hearts of most of his people. The wooden cross above the simple altar seemed almost apologetic in its presence, overshadowed by the ancient symbols carved into the stone walls by previous generations. When Astrid entered the chapel that evening, she found Thorvald waiting for her in the shadows near the back wall. He had exchanged his warrior's gear for simple traveling clothes, and in the dim light of the oil lamps, he looked more like a merchant or scholar than one of Magnus's soldiers. "You came," he said quietly. "I wasn't certain you would." "You knew my mother," Astrid said without preamble. "How?" "I knew her before she married your father. Before she became Astrid Eirik's daughter, she was Astrid Olafsdottir, daughter of Jarl Olaf the Just. She was my cousin." The words reordered everything Astrid thought she knew about her own history. Her mother had rarely spoken of her life before marriage, claiming that the past was less important than the present. But Jarl Olaf the Just had been a legendary figure, known throughout the northern lands for his wisdom and fairness, and for his mysterious disappearance 20 years ago. "That's impossible," Astrid whispered. "My mother's family died in a plague when she was young. My father told me. Your father told you what your mother asked him to tell you, because the truth would have put you in danger." Thorvald stepped closer, and in the lamplight she could see the family resemblance in the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "Olaf the Just didn't die of plague, cousin. He was murdered by Magnus Ironhand, along with most of his family. Your mother escaped only because she was visiting your father's lands when the attack came." The implications crashed over Astrid like a cold wave. If Thorvald was telling the truth, and the bone carving suggested he was, then she had more reason than anyone to want Magnus destroyed. Her mission had just become deeply personal. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because Magnus plans to claim the crown that rightfully belonged to my uncle, your grandfather. And because there are those of us who remember the old ways, who believe that blood calls to blood, and that justice delayed is not justice denied." Thorvald reached into his traveling pack and withdrew an object wrapped in dark cloth. When he unfolded it, Astrid saw a slender dagger with a silver blade and a hilt carved from what appeared to be whalebone. Ancient runes ran along the fuller, and the pommel bore the same raven symbol that had appeared on both her grandmother's brooch and the message he had given her. "This was your mother's blade," he said, offering it to her. "She carried it the day she fled her father's burning hall, and she made me promise to give it to her daughter when the time came for truth and justice to be served." Astrid's hands trembled as she accepted the weapon. It was lighter than she had expected, perfectly balanced for someone of her size and strength. When she wrapped her fingers around the hilt, it felt like coming home to something she had never known she was missing. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "The same thing you want Magnus Ironhand's destruction, but not through crude assassination or hopeless rebellion. Through careful planning, patient work, and the kind of justice that ensures his evil dies." With him, Thorvald's eyes held the fierce light of a man who had waited years for this moment. "Your father's plan to place you here was brilliant. But he didn't know about the documents Henrik has shown you, or about the network of people who have been waiting for the right moment to act. How many people are we talking about? More than you might think. Magnus rules through fear, but fear breeds resentment, and resentment breeds opportunity. There are servants who remember better days, warriors who are tired of serving a tyrant, and merchants who know the truth about Magnus's crimes. All they need is coordination and leadership. Astrid thought of the hidden chamber beneath the kitchens, of Henrik's bitter loyalty to dead friends, of Sven's innocent observations that revealed so much about the fortress's operations. She thought of her father, waiting in Norvik for intelligence. That could help him plan his next move. And she thought of her mother, dying young with secrets she had carried to protect her family. What would you have me do? Help me turn Magnus's own household against him. While he's away meeting with potential allies, we'll be building the alliance that will destroy him. And when he returns, we'll be ready to spring a trap that will end his reign forever. Thorvald began rapping the dagger again, but Astrid stopped him with a gesture. I'll keep it, she said, securing the blade beneath her skirts where it could be hidden but easily reached. If you're right about my heritage, then I have 20 years of justice to collect. Then you'll help us? I'll do more than help you, Astrid said, feeling something hard and determined crystallizing in her chest. I'll leave you. Magnus Ironhand killed my grandfather, terrorized my mother, and threatened my people. It's time he learned that some debts can only be paid in blood. As they prepared to leave the chapel separately to avoid suspicion, Thorvald paused at the door. There's something else you should know. When Magnus returns from his meeting with Eirik Bloodaxe, he'll be bringing more than just news of an alliance. He's planning something that will change the balance of power in the entire region, and it involves a crown that was stolen from your grandfather's tomb. The pieces of Magnus's ultimate plan were beginning to come together, and Astrid realized that her mission had just expanded far beyond gathering intelligence for her father. She was now part of a conspiracy that reached back 20 years and forward to a future that would be shaped by the choices made in the coming weeks. But first, she had a rebellion to organize. Magnus's departure from Ironhold created a strange atmosphere within the fortress walls, as if everyone could finally exhale after holding their breath for months. The oppressive weight of his presence lifted like morning fog, and conversations that had been whispered in corners could now be held in normal voices. It was during this brief respite that Astrid began to understand the true scope of discontent within. Magnus's household thought her mother's recipe book had become an unexpected tool in her growing network of resistance. What appeared to be a simple collection of cooking instructions was actually an ingenious code that Henrik had helped her develop, one that allowed her to pass detailed information about fortress defenses, guard rotations, and supply situations to trusted allies without arousing suspicion. A recipe for barley soup might contain details about the Eastern Wall's patrol schedule, while instructions for preserving meat could hide information about weapon stores and their locations. Brilliant, Thorvald had said when she showed him the system. Even if someone discovered the book, they would see only what they expected to see: a young woman trying to learn her mother's domestic skills. The network they were building operated on multiple levels. At the surface were the obvious allies, people like Henrik and Brenna, who had personal reasons to hate Magnus and were willing to take active risks to oppose him. Below them were the sympathizers, servants, and warriors who might not be ready for open rebellion, but could be counted on to look the other way at crucial moments or to provide small but vital pieces of information. That most valuable of all were the unknowing allies, people who opposed Magnus's rule without realizing they were part of a larger conspiracy. Sven fell into this category, continuing to provide detailed intelligence about the fortress's operations simply because he enjoyed sharing his knowledge with someone who listened with interest. Several of the younger warriors had begun confiding their doubts about Magnus's leadership to Astrid. seeing her as a harmless confidant who posed no threat to their positions. It was through one of these conversations that Astrid learned about the prisoners. "The dungeons have been busy lately," a warrior named Gunnar mentioned during the evening meal. He was a decent man who had joined Magnus's service only because his family lands had been destroyed in a border raid, and Astrid had sensed his growing unease with his master's methods. "More political prisoners," they say. "People who know too much about the wrong things." "What kind of things?" Astrid asked innocently. "The kind that get men's heads removed from their shoulders," Gunnar replied grimly. "Though word is these particular prisoners might be worth more alive than dead, at least for now." That night, Astrid shared this information with Thorvald during one of their carefully orchestrated meetings in the chapel. He received the news with visible concern, his hands clenching into fists as she described what little Gunnar had revealed. "I was afraid of this," he said. "Magnus has been systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his claim to regional leadership. If he's keeping prisoners alive, it means he has use for them either as bargaining chips or as sources of information he needs. Could any of them be useful to us? Potentially. But getting to them would require accessing the deepest parts of the fortress dungeons, areas that are heavily guarded and closely watched. It would be an enormous risk." Astrid thought of the hidden passages Henrik had shown her, the network of tunnels and chambers that Magnus had never discovered. What if there was a way to reach them without going through the normal entrances? Thorvald's eyes sharpened with interest. "What are you thinking?" Rather than explain, Astrid led him down to the kitchens and then into the root cellar, where Henrik was waiting as planned. The old cook had become an enthusiastic participant in their conspiracy, his years of resentment finally finding a productive outlet. "Show him," Astrid said simply. Henrik opened the hidden passage, and the three of them made their way through the narrow tunnel to the chamber where the incriminating documents were stored. But instead of stopping there, Henrik continued deeper, into the mountain, following passages that Astrid herself had never seen before. "The original builders of this fortress were thorough men," Henrik explained as they walked. "They created ways to move through the mountain that would allow them to escape during a siege, or to launch surprise attacks against besiegers. Some of these tunnels connect to the dungeons. The passage they followed seemed to wing through the very bones of the mountain, sometimes opening into natural caverns, sometimes narrowing to barely shoulder-width gaps between massive stones. The air was cold and damp, carrying strange echoes that made their footsteps sound like whispers in the darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Henrik stopped beside what appeared to be another solid wall. But when he pressed against a particular stone, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow chamber beyond. Through a barred opening on the far side, they could hear voices speaking in low, urgent tones. "The lower dungeons," Henrik whispered. "The cells where Magnus keeps his most important prisoners." Thorvald moved to the barred opening and peered through. What he saw made him go rigid with shock. "Uncle?" The voice that answered was weak but unmistakably familiar. "Thorvald? Is that really you? Or have I finally lost my mind completely?" It's me, Uncle. We're going to get you out of here." The reunion that followed was emotional and brief. Thorvald's uncle, Jarl Ragnar the Wise, had been Magnus's prisoner for more than 6 months, captured during what Magnus had claimed was a successful raid against raiders. In reality, Ragnar had been investigating Magnus's illegal activities and had gotten too close to the truth for his own safety. "There are others," Ragnar said urgently. "Magnus has been collecting anyone who might oppose his claim to the high crown. Jarl Eirik's son, 2 of the regional law speakers, even a bishop who refused to bless his ambitions. We're all evidence of crimes he doesn't dare let see the light of day." Astrid felt pieces of Magnus's grand plan clicking into place. He's not just trying to expand his territory. He's preparing to claim royal authority over the entire region. The crown of the High King, Thorvald said grimly. The one that was stolen from your grandfather's tomb. Magnus plans to have himself crowned as the rightful successor. But first, he needs to eliminate everyone who might challenge his legitimacy. Then we need to move faster than we planned, Astrid said. If Magnus succeeds in his meeting with Eirik, Bloodaxe and returns with a powerful ally, he'll have the strength to carry out his plan regardless of opposition. Getting the prisoners out would require careful coordination and considerable risk. The hidden passages could provide access, but moving multiple people through narrow tunnels without detection would be challenging. More importantly, the disappearance of such high-profile prisoners would immediately alert Magnus that his security had been compromised. We don't have to get them all out, Thorvald realized. We just need to get Uncle Ragnar to safety. He knows enough about Magnus's crimes to destroy him in any court of law, and his testimony would rally every honest Jarl in the region against Magnus's ambitions. And the others? Astrid asked. We protect them as best we can and prepare for the final confrontation. Because once we move against Magnus, there won't be any going back. Over the following days, they refined their plan with the meticulous care of people who understood that failure would mean death for everyone involved. Henrik mapped out the most secure route through the hidden passages. Thorvald identified allies within the fortress who could provide diversions and support. Astrid used her position in the kitchens to gather detailed information about guard schedules and fortress routines. The rescue was planned for the night before Magnus's expected return, when his absence would provide maximum cover for their activities. But before his presence could complicate their escape plans, Ragnar would be smuggled out through the hidden passages and taken to a safe location where he could begin rallying opposition to Magnus's rule. But their careful plans received an unexpected complication when a messenger arrived with news that Magnus's negotiations had concluded successfully. Eirik Bloodaxe had agreed to the alliance, and Magnus was returning to Ironhold immediately with a significant portion of Eirik's war band as his guests. The celebration of this alliance would provide perfect cover for Magnus's coronation ceremony, which was now scheduled to take place within the week. We're out of time, Thorvald said when they met that night to discuss the changed circumstances. If Magnus returns with Eirik's warriors supporting him, we'll never have another chance to stop his coronation. Then, we don't wait for him to return, Astrid said firmly. We act now, tonight, while the fortress is still lightly guarded and before Magnus can consolidate his new alliance. It was a desperate gamble, but all their options had become desperate. They would rescue Ragnar, gather what evidence they could from the hidden chamber, and then flee Ironhold to rally opposition forces before Magnus could complete his transformation from regional warlord to self-proclaimed king. As they made their final preparations, Astrid touched the silver blade hidden beneath her skirts and thought of her mother, who had carried the weapon while fleeing from Magnus's earlier crimes. History was about to come full circle, and this time justice would not be denied. The game of shadows they had been playing was about to become a war, and the outcome would determine the fate of everyone they loved. The rescue of Jarl. Ragnar proceeded with a precision that surprised even Astrid. The hidden passages that Henrik had revealed proved to be even more extensive than they had imagined, forming a complete network that allowed movement throughout the fortress without detection. By the time the guards discovered that the most important prisoner was missing, Ragnar was already miles away, riding hard for the territory of Jarl-born Ironwood, one of the few regional leaders who had never bent the knee to Magnus. But their success came with an unexpected price. As dawn broke over Ironhold, a commotion in the courtyard drew Astrid to her window, where she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. Magnus had returned a full day earlier than expected, and he was not alone. Behind his own war band, rode the warriors of Eirik Bloodaxe, their banners snapping in the morning wind. But it was the third group that made Astrid's heart stop. A column of men wearing the colors of the High King's Own Guard. The political landscape had just shifted in ways none of them had anticipated. Thorvald found her in the kitchens an hour later, his face grim with news that confirmed her worst fears. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly, pretending to help her knead bread while Henrik kept watch for eavesdroppers. Magnus didn't just ally with Eirik Bloodaxe. He's been legitimized by the crown itself. "What do you mean?" "The High King is dead, killed in a hunting accident 3 days ago. His heir is a boy of 12, and the Regency Council is split between rival factions. Magnus has convinced one of those factions that he represents stability in the northern territories, and they've granted him extraordinary authority to maintain order during the transition." The implications crashed over Astrid like a cold wave. Magnus no longer needed to steal legitimacy through a false coronation. He had been handed legal authority by the crown itself, making him virtually untouchable by conventional means. "There's more," Thorvald continued. "The object he brought back isn't just any crown. It's the crown of the First Kings, thought lost for centuries. Somehow Magnus has convinced the regents that he discovered it during his negotiations with Eirik, and they've agreed to let him wear it as a symbol of his authority over the northern territories." Henrik's weathered face went pale. "The false crown," he whispered. "I knew I recognized it when they brought it in this morning." "False crown?" Astrid asked. "It's a replica," Henrik explained. "The real crown of the First Kings was hidden when the last High King died, supposedly to prevent it from falling into unworthy hands. What Magnus has is a masterful copy, created by the same craftsman who made the original. But he's convinced the regents that it's genuine, which means he's not just claiming authority through deception," Thorvald finished. "He's about to be granted it legally, with the full backing of whatever royal authority still exists." The situation had become exponentially more dangerous. With legal legitimacy and powerful allies, Magnus would be nearly impossible to oppose through conventional rebellion. Worse, their rescue of Ragnar would now be seen not as justice, but as treason against the crown's appointed representative. "We need to get word to my father immediately," Astrid said. "He needs to know that the game has changed completely." But even as she spoke, she knew that her father's carefully laid plans would need to be reconsidered entirely. The intelligence network they had built, the alliances they had forged, even the evidence they had gathered, all of it paled in significance beside the legal authority Magnus now wielded. That afternoon brought a summons that Astrid had been dreading. Magnus requested her presence in the Great Hall, where he intended to formally announce their wedding date to his assembled guests. She dressed carefully in her finest gown, the blue wool trimmed with silver that had belonged to her mother, and made sure that both her hidden dagger and her grandmother's brooch were securely concealed. The Great Hall had been transformed for the occasion. New tapestries bearing Magnus's wolf sigil hung beside banners representing Eirik Bloodaxe and the royal regency. At the head table sat the crown's representatives, stern-faced men who radiated the cold authority of those accustomed to being obeyed. Without question, Eirik Bloodaxe himself was there as well, a massive man with iron-gray hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in battle. But it was Magnus who commanded the room's attention. He had exchanged his usual practical clothing for robes of rich purple trimmed with gold, and upon his head sat the false crown that Henrik had identified. In the flickering light of the torches, the crown's false gems caught and reflected the flames, creating an illusion of power that was almost hypnotic in its effect. "Lords and warriors," Magnus began, his voice carrying easily across the packed hall. "Today marks the beginning of a new era in the Northern Territories. With the blessing of the crown and the support of our allies, we will bring order to lands that have known too much chaos. prosperity to people who have known too much want. The speech that followed was masterfully crafted, painting Magnus as a reluctant leader who had accepted the burden of authority only to serve the greater good. He spoke of uniting the fractured northern Jarls under a single banner, of ending the petty wars that had plagued the region for generations, of creating a lasting peace that would benefit all. It was, Astrid realized, exactly the kind of speech that would appeal to war-weary people who genuinely wanted stability and peace. Magnus wasn't just seizing power through force. He was offering a vision that many would find genuinely attractive. But personal happiness must not be forgotten. In the pursuit of greater goals, Magnus continued, his eyes finding Astrid in the crowd. It is my pleasure to announce that my marriage to the noble Jarl Eirik's daughter will take place in 3 days' time, cementing the alliance between my house and the respected Jarl Eirik Thornson. The hall erupted in polite applause, but Astrid barely heard it. 3 days. She had 3 days before she would be bound to Magnus, not just legally, but in the eyes of both God and the old gods. Once that ceremony was complete, any action against him would make her appear to be a faithless wife betraying her. Lawful husband. As the formal announcement concluded and the gathered nobles began to mingle, Astrid found herself approached by one of the crown's representatives. He was a thin, scholarly-looking man with pale eyes and soft hands that had never held a weapon. "Lady Astrid," he said with a bow that was precise but not particularly respectful, "I am Lord Eirik speaking for the Regency Council. We understand that your father has shown some reluctance to fully embrace Lord Magnus's authority in the region." The words were polite, but the thread underneath was clear. "My father is a loyal subject of the crown," Astrid replied carefully. "He has always served the realm's interests, of course, but loyalty can be demonstrated in many ways. The Regency Council would view your enthusiastic participation in this alliance as a strong indication of your family's commitment to the new order." Astrid felt the trap closing around her. Not only was she expected to marry Magnus, but her behavior during and after the wedding would be seen as a reflection of her father's loyalty to the crown. Any sign of reluctance or resistance could be used as justification for moving against Norvik directly. "I understand," she said, forcing herself to smile. "I am honored to play whatever role serves the realm's greater good." Lord Eirik studied her face for a moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "I'm sure you are. The Regency Council is particularly interested in ensuring that the Northern Territories remain stable during these uncertain times. Your marriage will be seen as a symbol of that stability." As the evening wore on, Astrid began to understand the true brilliance of Magnus's strategy. By obtaining legal legitimacy from the crown, he had transformed himself from a regional warlord into an official representative of royal authority. Anyone who opposed him now would be branded as rebels against the crown itself, making it virtually impossible to rally broad support for resistance. But perhaps more importantly, he had positioned himself as the guarantor of stability in a time of uncertainty. With the old High King dead and his heir a child, people throughout the realm would be looking for strong leadership that could prevent chaos and civil war. Magnus was offering exactly that, wrapped in the trappings of legal authority and traditional legitimacy. It was a masterstroke that neutralized most conventional forms of opposition. But Astrid was beginning to realize that it also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Magnus's new position depended entirely on maintaining the illusion that he was a legitimate representative of royal authority. If that illusion could be shattered, if his crimes could be exposed in a way that even his allies couldn't ignore, then his entire carefully constructed edifice would collapse. The problem was that they now had only 3 days to accomplish what had seemed impossible, even with unlimited time. That night, as Astrid met with Thorvald and Henrik in the hidden chamber beneath the kitchens, the weight of their situation pressed down on them like the stone of the mountain itself. The documents that had seemed so damning now felt inadequate. against Magnus's legal backing. The network of allies they had built suddenly seemed small and powerless against the combined might of royal authority and Eirik Bloodaxe's warband. "We could try to get you out," Thorvald suggested. "Smuggle you away through the hidden passages before the wedding can take place." "And then what?" Astrid asked. "Magnus would declare me a runaway bride, claim that my father was behind the escape, and use it as justification to attack Norvik with the full backing of the crown. My people would be branded as rebels, and Magnus would have legal authority to crush them completely." Henrik nodded grimly. "She's right. Running away would only make things worse for everyone we're trying to protect." "Then what do you suggest?" Thorvald asked. "Let the wedding proceed and hope we can find some way to oppose Magnus afterward?" Astrid was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The false crown sat at the center of everything. It was the symbol of Magnus's authority, the foundation of his legitimacy, and the key to his power. But it was also his greatest vulnerability, because it was built on a lie that could be exposed. "What would happen," she asked slowly, "if the real crown of the first kings were to appear? If someone could prove that Magnus's crown is a fake?" Henrik's eyes widened with understanding. His authority would evaporate instantly. The Regency Council would have to withdraw their support, and his allies would abandon him rather than be associated with such a massive deception. "But the real crown has been lost for decades," Thorvald pointed out. "No one knows where it is, or even if it still exists." Astrid touched the silver blade hidden beneath her skirts, thinking of her mother's dying words about secrets that had been kept to protect the family. Maybe someone does know. Maybe the secret of its location was preserved by people who understood that someday it would be needed to stop exactly this kind of deception. She was thinking of her grandfather, Jarl Olaf the Just, and the reputation for wisdom and foresight that had made him legendary. If anyone would have taken steps to preserve the true crown against future need, it would have been him. And if he had done so, there was only one person who would have been trusted with that knowledge. "I need to send a message to my father," Astrid said firmly. "Not about military intelligence or alliance building, but about family history. About secrets that a mother might have shared with a daughter before she died." The game had changed completely, but it wasn't over yet. Magnus thought he had won by obtaining legal legitimacy, but legitimacy built on deception was fragile. If they could expose the lie at the heart of his authority, they could bring down not just Magnus, but the entire structure of corruption that had enabled his rise to power. The wedding was still 3 days away, and in those 3 days, they would either find a way to destroy Magnus's false legitimacy or watch him consolidate power that would make him untouchable for generations to come. The stakes had never been higher, but then again, the most important battles had always been fought when defeat seemed certain and victory impossible. The message Astrid sent to her father was disguised as a simple request for her mother's remaining possessions, a perfectly natural desire for a bride wanting familiar things around her on her wedding day. But embedded within the innocent words, using the code they had developed years ago for their private correspondence, was a desperate question about family secrets that might hold the key to everything. The response came back faster than she had dared hope, carried by a merchant who traded regularly between Norvik and the surrounding territories. Hidden within a package of her mother's jewelry and personal effects was a letter that made Astrid's hands tremble as she read it in the privacy of her chamber. Her father had kept more secrets than she had ever imagined. Eirik's letter confirmed her suspicions about their family's true history, but it also revealed something that changed everything. Her mother hadn't just escaped from Olaf the Just's burning hall. She had carried something with her, something that Olaf had entrusted to her care in the final moments before Magnus's attack. The real crown of the first kings hadn't been lost at all. It had been hidden in Norvik for 20 years, waiting for the day when it would be needed to restore legitimate authority to the realm. But the letter also contained disturbing news about the political situation beyond Ironhold's walls. The Regency Council was fracturing, with different factions supporting different candidates for power during the young king's minority. Magnus's alliance with one faction had been balanced by other groups rallying behind different regional leaders, including a growing movement that supported Jarl Ragnar's claim to represent the traditional noble houses. The realm was sliding toward civil war, and Magnus's wedding to Astrid was being seen by all sides as a crucial political statement. If the ceremony proceeded successfully, it would be interpreted as a sign that the northern territories had definitively chosen sides in the coming conflict. "We can't let this wedding happen," Thorvald said when Astrid shared the contents of her father's letter. They were meeting in the chapel again, the only place in the fortress where they could speak freely without risk of being overheard. "If Magnus succeeds in marrying you, it will legitimize his authority in ways that even exposing the false crown might not undo. But we also can't simply prevent it," Astrid replied. "Magnus has too much support now, and too many witnesses. If something happens to disrupt the ceremony, he'll blame my father and use it as justification for attacking Norvik immediately." Henrik had been listening to their conversation with the thoughtful expression of a man working through a complex problem. "What if the ceremony wasn't disrupted?" he said slowly, "but transformed? What if instead of preventing the wedding, we used it as the stage for revealing Magnus's deceptions?" "What do you mean?" Astrid asked. "Think about it. Magnus has invited representatives from the Regency Council, alliance partners like Eirik Bloodaxe, and noble guests from throughout the region. They're all going to be gathered in one place, expecting to witness a ceremony that confirms Magnus's legitimacy. What if instead they witnessed something that destroyed it completely?" The idea was audacious and dangerous, but it had a beautiful symmetry to it. Magnus intended to use the wedding as a display of his power and authority. If they could turn that same gathering into the moment of his exposure and downfall, the impact would be devastating, but it would also require precise timing, careful coordination, and enormous personal risk. Astrid would need to go through with the ceremony almost to its completion, maintaining the deception until the perfect moment to reveal the truth. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and Magnus would have both the legal authority of marriage and the political legitimacy he sought. "There's something else," Astrid said quietly. "My father's letter mentioned that Jarl Ragnar has been gathering allies faster than anyone expected. He'll be moving against Magnus within days, possibly as soon as tomorrow night. Then we need to coordinate our timing with his," Thorvald said. "If we can expose Magnus's deceptions at the same moment that Ragnar's forces arrive, we can catch him between internal revolt and external attack." The next 2 days passed in a blur of careful preparation disguised as wedding planning. Astrid played the part of an eager bride, working with the fortress's seamstresses to prepare her wedding dress and consulting with Henrik about the feast that would follow the ceremony. But every detail was actually part of a complex plan designed to position their allies in the right places at the right time. The Warhorn of Kings became the linchpin of their strategy. The ancient instrument had been part of Ironhold's treasures since the fortress was built. A massive horn carved from the tusk of some legendary beast and bound with silver rings inscribed with runes of summoning. According to tradition, its sound could be heard for miles in all directions, and it had historically been used to call all loyal vassals to their lord's aid in times of desperate need. Magnus, in his arrogance, had decided to have the horn sounded during the wedding ceremony as a symbol of his authority and a call for all the northern territories to acknowledge his leadership. What he didn't know was that Henrik had spent years learning the horn's ancient sequences, including signals that predated Magnus's rule by centuries. "There are 3 traditional calls," Henrik explained as they finalized their plans. The first summons vassals to their lord's aid. The second calls all free men to defend their homeland. But the third is the call of justice, used only when a usurper has been exposed and the rightful authority needs to be restored. If they could substitute the third call for the first during the ceremony, it would send an unmistakable message to anyone within hearing distance who understood the old traditions. More importantly, it would serve as a signal to Ragnar's approaching forces that the moment for action had arrived. But the horn was only part of the plan. The real centerpiece would be the revelation of Magnus's deceptions at the moment when he expected to claim final victory. Astrid had concealed the real crown of the first kings within her wedding dress, itself sewn into the fabric in a way that would allow her to reveal it at the crucial moment. The contrast between the true crown and Magnus's fake would be impossible for anyone to miss, especially the representatives of the Regency Council who had been deceived into supporting him. The night before the wedding, Astrid stood in her chamber window, looking out over the courtyard where servants were making final preparations for the ceremony. Torches had been set up to provide light for the evening festivities, and she could see guards taking their positions along the walls. In a few hours, this place would either witness Magnus's ultimate triumph or his complete downfall. Thorvald found her there, having made his way through the servant passages that had become their secret highway through the fortress. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. "I've been ready for 20 years, Astrid replied, touching the silver blade hidden beneath her nightgown. "Ever since my mother died carrying secrets she never had the chance to reveal. And if something goes wrong? If Magnus discovers our plan before we can execute it?" Astrid turned from the window to face her cousin fully. "Then, at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have given our people a chance at justice instead of accepting injustice for the sake of temporary peace." They reviewed the plan one final time, checking every detail and contingency they could think of. Henrik would position himself near the horn during the ceremony, ready to sound the call of justice at Astrid's signal. Thorvald would be among the wedding guests, prepared to lead the fortress's hidden allies in securing key positions once the revolt began. Other conspirators throughout the household would be ready to act on predetermined signals, cutting off escape routes and preventing Magnus's supporters from regrouping. But the most dangerous role belonged to Astrid herself. She would need to go through most of the wedding ceremony, speaking the vows that would bind her to Magnus in the eyes of the law and the church. Only at the very last moment, when Magnus was expecting to claim his final victory, would she reveal the truth that would destroy him. "There's one more thing," Thorvald said as they prepared to part for the night. "If this works, if we succeed in bringing Magnus down, what happens afterward? The realm is still sliding toward civil war, and your father will need allies if he's going to help restore legitimate authority." "We'll face that challenge when we come to it," Astrid said. "But first we need to survive tomorrow, and that means making sure that every part of our plan works exactly as intended." As Thorvald slipped away through the hidden passages, Astrid remained at her window, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about the generations of her family who had faced impossible choices in defense of justice and honor. Tomorrow she would either vindicate their sacrifices or join them in noble failure, but she would not go quietly into the darkness that Magnus represented. She would not allow her people to be condemned to a future built on lies and deception. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, she would see justice done. The wedding was tomorrow, and with it would come either redemption or destruction for everyone she loved. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with a crystalline sky that seemed to promise either triumph or tragedy. Astrid woke before the servants came to prepare her, spending the early hours in silent prayer to both the old gods and the new, asking for strength to carry out what needed to be done and wisdom to know the right moment to act. When Helga and the other women arrived to dress her, they found her already bathed and braided, sitting calmly by the window as if this were just another ordinary day. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of northern craftsmanship, rich blue silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the light like captured starfire. Hidden within the elaborate folds of the skirt, sewn into a secret pocket that appeared to be nearly decorative, was the true crown of the first kings, smaller than Magnus's false crown, but infinitely more precious, its ancient gold still bright after centuries of hidden guardianship. "You look beautiful, my lady," Helga said as she made the final adjustments to the dress. There were tears in the older woman's eyes, and Astrid realized that she had become genuinely fond of the girl she believed was walking toward an uncertain fate. "Thank you for all your kindness," Astrid replied, taking Helga's weathered hands in her own. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that your friendship has meant more to me than you realize." The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Magnus had spared no expense in creating a ceremony that would impress his noble guests and reinforce his claim to legitimacy. Tapestries bearing the royal arms hung alongside his own wolf banners, while the representatives of the Regency Council sat in places of honor near the altar that had been erected for the occasion. The bishop who would perform the ceremony was an elderly man who radiated the quiet authority of someone who had served the church through decades of political upheaval. But it was Magnus himself who commanded the room's attention. He stood at the altar wearing robes of purple and gold, with the false crown of the first kings gleaming on his head. In the flickering light of hundreds of candles, he looked every inch the legitimate ruler he claimed to be. Even Astrid had to admit that he presented a compelling figure of authority and strength. Eirik Bloodaxe sat in the front row of guests, his scarred face showing approval as he watched his new ally prepare to cement their political partnership. The representatives of the Regency Council wore expressions of polite interest, clearly viewing this ceremony as confirmation that they had chosen the right man to stabilize the Northern Territories. As Astrid entered the hall, escorted by two of Magnus's most trusted warriors in lieu of her absent father, a murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. She moved with the measured pace of a woman who understood the solemnity of the occasion, her face composed and serene despite the turmoil beneath. Magnus's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she approached the altar. This was his moment of ultimate triumph, the ceremony that would transform him from a regional warlord into a legitimate ruler with the backing of both church and crown. Everything he had worked for, schemed for, killed for, was about to be realized. "Dearly beloved," the bishop began, his voice carrying easily across the packed hall, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Magnus, Lord of Ironhand, and Protector of the Northern Territories, with Astrid, daughter of Jarl Eirik Thornson." The familiar words of the marriage ceremony began to flow over the assembled crowd, but Astrid was only half listening. Her attention was focused on Henrik, who stood near the great horn at the side of the hall, and on Thorvald, who had positioned himself among the wedding guests where he could signal their other allies when the moment came. Everything depended on timing. Too early, and Magnus would have time to recover and maintain control. Too late, and she would be legally bound to him in ways that would complicate everything that followed. The ceremony proceeded with stately formality through the opening prayers and the reading of sacred texts. Magnus spoke his vows with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall as he promised to honor and protect his bride. When it came time for Astrid to speak, she delivered her own vows with equal clarity, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "Do you, Magnus, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" the bishop asked. "I do," Magnus replied, his voice ringing with triumph. "Do you, Astrid, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" This was the moment. In seconds, the bishop would pronounce them married, and Magnus would have achieved the final legitimization of his authority. But it was also the moment when all eyes were focused on the ceremony, when everyone in the hall was paying attention to the words being spoken at the altar. "I do," Astrid said clearly. Then, before the bishop could continue, she raised her voice so that everyone in the hall could hear her clearly. "But first, there is something these witnesses must know about the man they believe they are honoring." Magnus's face went rigid with shock and anger. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. "I am revealing the truth," Astrid replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. "The truth about the crown you wear, the authority you claim, and the crimes you have committed." Before Magnus could stop her, she reached into the hidden pocket of her wedding dress and withdrew the true crown of the first kings. Even in the candlelight, the difference between the genuine article and Magnus's fake was immediately apparent. The real crown seemed to glow with its own inner light, its ancient gold unmarked by time, and its genuine gems blazing with captured fire. "This," Astrid announced, holding the crown high so that everyone could see it, "is the true crown of the first kings, hidden for 20 years to prevent it from falling into unworthy hands. What Magnus wears is a clever fake, just as his claim to legitimate authority is a clever deception." The hall erupted into chaos. The representatives of the Regency Council surged to their feet, demanding explanations. Eirik Bloodacce's hand went to his sword as he tried to understand how his ally had been exposed as a fraud. Magnus himself stood, frozen at the altar, his face cycling through shock, rage, and calculation as he tried to find a way to recover from this devastating revelation. "Lies!" he roared, finally finding his voice. "This is some trick, some deception orchestrated by enemies who cannot accept legitimate authority." But the damage was already done. Lord Eirik, the scholarly representative of the Regency Council, had moved close enough to examine both crowns, and his face had gone pale as he recognized the authentic royal craftsmanship of the crown Astrid. "Held! Guards!" Magnus shouted. "Arrest this woman for treason against the crown's appointed representative." Several of his warriors started toward the altar, but Thorvald was already moving. At his signal, all eyes throughout the hall began to reveal themselves. Henrik abandoned his position near the horn and drew a sword that had been hidden among the kitchen implements. Servants who had seemed harmless suddenly produced weapons and moved to block the exits. Even some of Magnus's own warriors hesitated, unsure whether they should follow orders from a man whose authority had just been revealed as fraudulent. "The horn, Henrik!" Astrid called out, and the old cook moved with surprising speed toward the war horn of kings. But Magnus was faster. With a roar of pure rage, he launched himself toward Astrid, drawing the sword at his side as he moved. The false crown tumbled from his head and clattered across the stone floor as he abandoned all pretense of legitimacy in favor of raw violence. Astrid had been expecting this. As Magnus closed the distance between them, she drew her mother's silver blade from its hiding place beneath her wedding dress. The blade that had once belonged to the daughter of Olaf, the just sang through the air as she met. Magnus's attack was steel of her own. The sound of clashing metal rang through the hall as the two of them fought at the altar where they had been meant to be married. Magnus was skilled and experienced, but he was also blinded by rage and fighting in ceremonial robes that restricted his movement. Astrid was smaller and seemingly weaker, but she had the advantage of preparation and the desperate strength that comes from fighting for everything one loves. Around them, the hall had become a battlefield as Magnus's supporters clashed with the hidden network of rebels that Astrid and Thorvald had assembled. The representatives of the Regency Council had withdrawn to a defensive position near the main entrance, clearly intending to flee at the first opportunity, rather than choose sides in what was rapidly becoming a civil war in miniature. The sound of the war horn suddenly boomed across the hall, but it was not the call Magnus had planned. Henrik had reached the instrument and was sounding the ancient call of justice. the signal that a usurper had been exposed and that all loyal subjects should rally to restore legitimate authority. The horn's call echoed off the mountains and carried for miles in all directions, reaching the ears of Jarl Ragnar's approaching forces and telling them that the moment for action had finally arrived. The battle that erupted in the great Hall of Ironhand was unlike anything the ancient stones had witnessed before. What had begun as a wedding ceremony had transformed into a desperate struggle for the future of the northern territories, with the fate of kingdoms hanging in the balance of steel and courage. Magnus fought with the fury of a man who saw his life's work crumbling around him. His sword work was masterful, honed by years of combat and driven now by absolute desperation. But Astrid met him blow for blow, her mother's silver blade moving with deadly precision as she fought not just for her own life, but for justice that had been 20 years in the making. You think you can destroy me with parlor tricks and family heirlooms? Magnus snarled as their weapons locked at the crossguards. I am the appointed representative of the crown. I have armies at my command. You have nothing but lies and stolen authority, Astrid replied, breaking the lock and spinning away from his follow-up strike. And lies always crumble when exposed to truth. Around them, the larger battle raged with increasing intensity. Thorvald had rallied the household rebels and was leading them in a coordinated assault against Magnus's personal guard, while Henrik and his kitchen allies had secured the hall's main entrance to prevent Magnus's supporters from escaping to raise the alarm. The representatives of the Regency Council huddled in a defensive circle, protected by their own guards, while they tried to decide which side offered them the best chance of survival. Eirik Bloodaxe had initially moved to support his ally, but the revelation of the false crown had shaken his confidence. He stood with his weapon drawn, but had not yet committed to either side, clearly calculating whether Magnus's cause was still worth supporting now that his legitimacy had been exposed. The tide of battle began to turn when the sound of horns echoed from beyond the fortress walls, not the war horn of kings that Henrik had sounded, but the battle calls of approaching armies. Through the narrow windows of the great hall, the flicker of torches could be seen moving up the mountain roads, and the sound of marching feet grew steadily louder. Jarl Ragnar approaches. One of Thorvald's allies shouted from a window, "The rightful forces of justice are at our gates." The news sent a shock through the hall. Magnus's supporters suddenly found themselves facing not just internal rebellion but external attack from a force that now had every reason to view them as usurpers and criminals. Several of his warriors threw down their weapons and attempted to surrender, while others fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they faced execution if captured. Magnus himself seemed to grow more dangerous as his position became more hopeless. With a roar of pure rage, he abandoned his duel with Astrid and lunged toward the representatives of the Regency Council, clearly intending to take hostages who might still provide him with bargaining power. But Astrid was faster. Her mother's blade caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the stone steps that led to his now empty throne. The false crown that had fallen earlier lay shattered nearby, its paste gems scattered across the floor like drops of blood in the torchlight. "It's over, Magnus," Astrid said, advancing on him with her weapon ready. "Your deceptions are exposed, your allies are abandoning you, and the forces of justice are at your gates. Surrender now, and perhaps you'll live long enough to face proper judgment for your crimes." Magnus laughed, a sound like breaking glass that held no humor at all. "You think this ends anything? You think exposing one lie will somehow restore order to a realm that's tearing itself apart? The Regency Council will fragment completely now. The northern territories will descend into chaos, and your precious justice will drown in the blood of civil war. Perhaps," Astrid acknowledged, "but at least it will be honest chaos, not the false peace built on your murders and deceptions." Before Magnus could respond, the great doors of the hall burst open to admit Jarl Ragnar and his war band. The older man moved with the confidence of someone who had spent months planning for this moment, his weathered face showing satisfaction as he took in the scene before him, his nephew Thorvald leading the rebels, Magnus bleeding and defeated, and Astrid holding the true crown of the first kings like a banner of legitimate authority. "Uncle," Thorvald called out, his voice carrying relief and triumph in equal measure. "The fortress is ours, and Magnus's deceptions have been exposed before witnesses from the Regency Council itself." Ragnar nodded grimly as his warriors moved to secure the hall and disarm the remaining resistance. Then justice has finally been served, though it comes 20 years later than it should have. The representatives of the Regency Council found themselves in an impossible position. They had come to witness what they believed would be the legitimization of Magnus's authority, only to discover that they had been deceived by a masterful fraud. Now they faced the humiliating prospect of returning to the capital to admit that they had been completely fooled by a regional warlord with delusions of grandeur. Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his scholarly face pale but determined. "Lady Astrid," he said formally, "if I may examine the crown you carry?" Astrid handed over the precious artifact, watching as the Regency Council's representative subjected it to careful scrutiny. His expertise in royal regalia was evident as he examined the craftsmanship, tested the weight of the gold, and studied the gems with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his robes. "This is genuine," he announced finally, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and chagrin. "This is indeed the true crown of the first kings, lost for decades and now miraculously recovered." He turned to Magnus, who sat slumped against the throne steps, his wounded shoulder leaving a trail of blood on the ancient stone. "Which means that everything you told us about your authority and legitimacy was fabricated." Magnus met his gaze with defiant hatred. "I gave you stability. I offered you a strong leader who could unite the northern territories and prevent the chaos that's coming. What does it matter if some of the details were ... embellished? It matters because legitimate authority cannot be built on lies," Ragnar said, stepping forward to accept the crown from Lord Aldrich. "It matters because the people deserve leaders who earn their trust through honest service, not those who steal it through deception and murder." Eirik Bloodaxe, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally sheathed his weapon and approached the group around the throne. "I supported Magnus because I believed he represented legitimate authority," he said simply. "If that authority was fraudulent, then my alliance was based on false premises. I withdraw my support and offer my apologies to those who have suffered from my error in judgment." It was a political masterstroke that effectively ended any remaining resistance to the new order. With Eirik's withdrawal of support, Magnus's cause became hopeless, and his remaining followers quickly surrendered rather than face certain defeat. But even as victory was secured, Astrid found herself thinking about Magnus's words regarding the chaos that would follow. He was probably right that exposing his deceptions would create short-term instability in the northern territories. The Regency Council would need to find new ways to maintain order during the young king's minority, and the various noble houses would need to renegotiate their relationships without Magnus's false authority to provide structure. "What happens now?" she asked Ragnar as they watched Magnus's supporters being disarmed and secured. "Now we begin the harder work of building something better than what we've destroyed," the older man replied. Magnus was right about one thing. It's easier to tear down corrupt authority than it is to build legitimate alternatives. But that's the work of justice, and it's work that can't be avoided simply because it's difficult. As the immediate crisis wound down and order was restored to the Great Hall, Astrid realized that her own role in these events was far from over. She had helped expose Magnus's deceptions and bring about his downfall, but the questions of what would replace his authority and how the northern territories would be governed in the future still needed to be answered. The shattered throne that Magnus had built would need to be replaced with something more solid and honest. The work of justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Astrid stood once again at the edge of the fjord where her story had begun. But the world around her had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The mist still clung to the water in the early morning hours, and the familiar sounds of Norvik stirring to life still carried on the wind. But everything felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had pressed down on the entire region for years had finally been lifted. In her hands, she held not a weapon this time, but a letter bearing the seal of the Regency Council. The contents announced the formal establishment of the Northern Alliance, a confederation of the regions. Jarls who had agreed to work together and maintain peace and prosperity while remaining loyal to the crown. Jarl Ragnar had been confirmed as the Alliance's first leader, chosen not through conquest or deception, but through the honest support of his peers. Magnus Ironhand was dead, executed after a trial that had laid bare the full scope of his crimes. The proceedings had taken weeks, as witness after witness had come forward to testify about murders, thefts, and betrayals that stretched back more than a decade. In the end, even his former supporters had been forced to acknowledge that his reign had been built on a foundation of violence and lies that could never have sustained itself indefinitely. But perhaps more importantly, his death had marked the end of an era when might alone could determine right. The Northern Alliance operated under written laws and formal agreements that protected the rights of both nobles and common folk, creating a system where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Lost in thought again? The voice belonged to her father, who had approached while she was contemplating the water. Eirik looked older than he had 6 months ago, aged by the worry and stress of the events that had unfolded, but also somehow more at peace. The respect he had temporarily lost when he appeared to betray his daughter had been restored tenfold when the truth of their plan became known. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Astrid replied, turning to embrace him. "Sometimes it seems impossible that all of this grew out of that morning when you told me about Magnus's demands. The seeds of change are often planted in moments of impossible choice," Eirik said wisely. "Your mother always believed that the most important decisions we make are the ones that force us to choose between what seems safe and what we know to be right." They walked together toward the settlement, where preparations were underway for a celebration that would mark the first anniversary of the Northern Alliance. Representatives from all the member territories would be gathering to renew their commitments to peaceful cooperation and to discuss the challenges that lay ahead. Astrid had been elected to serve as one of the Alliance's coordinators, a role that combined diplomatic and administrative responsibilities in ways that suited her talents perfectly. She had discovered that the skills she had developed as a spy, the ability to listen carefully, to see beyond surface appearances, and to build networks of trust and cooperation translated remarkably well to the work of governance. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Eirik said as they reached the settlement's outskirts. "Lord Thorvald has requested permission to court you formally. He's been quite persistent about following proper protocols, despite everything you've been through together." Astrid smiled at the mention of her cousin, who had become both a close friend and something, potentially more during the months of rebuilding that had followed Magnus's defeat. "And what did you tell him?" "That the decision was entirely yours to make. You've proven more than capable of choosing your own path in life." It was true. The shy, uncertain girl who had been mocked for her size and considered unworthy of notice had been replaced by a woman who commanded respect through her intelligence, courage, and integrity. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and permanent. "I told him I would consider his proposal," Astrid said, "but not until after the Alliance's first year is complete. There's still too much work to be done too. Be distracted by romance, Eirik chuckled. Your mother would have said exactly the same thing. She always insisted that duty comes before personal happiness, though I think she found that the two weren't mutually exclusive in the end. As they entered the settlement, Astrid was struck by the changes that had occurred there as well. New buildings had been constructed to house the refugees who had fled Magnus's territories during his reign of terror. The harbor had been expanded to accommodate the increased trade that came with regional stability. Most importantly, children played in the streets without the shadow of fear that had hung over the northern territories for so long. The great hall where the celebration would take place had been rebuilt and expanded, its walls now decorated with tapestries depicting not conquest and domination but cooperation and justice. The false crown that Magnus had worn was displayed in a place of honor, but not as a symbol of authority, rather as a reminder of the dangers of allowing ambition to corrupt legitimate power. During the celebration that evening, Astrid found herself thinking about the artifacts that had played such crucial roles in the events of the past year. Her mother's locket still hung around her neck, a daily reminder of the love that had sustained her through the darkest moments. The silver dagger rested in a place of honor in her chamber, no longer needed as a weapon, but preserved as a symbol of the justice that had finally been served. The true crown of the first kings had been returned to the royal treasury, where it would wait for the young king to come of age and claim his birthright. But its brief appearance had served its purpose, proving that legitimate authority could not be stolen or faked, only earned through honest service to the people. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around her, Astrid stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The stars wheeled overhead in the same patterns that had guided her ancestors, and the fjord stretched away into darkness, just as it had on the morning when her journey began. But she was no longer the same person who had stood at this spot 6 months ago, wondering what choices lay ahead. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, forged friendships that would last a lifetime, and helped to create something that would benefit generations yet to come. Thorvald found her there, as she had somehow known he would. Feeling overwhelmed by all the attention? He asked, joining her at the water's edge. Just grateful, she replied. Grateful for the chance to help build something better than what we inherited, and grateful for the people who made it possible, including a certain Jarl's daughter who had the courage to walk into an enemy fortress and bring down a tyrant from within. Astrid laughed. Including a certain supposed warrior who turned out to be the rightful heir to stolen lands and had the patience to wait 20 years for justice. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the water and listening to the sounds of celebration behind them. The future stretched ahead with all its challenges and uncertainties, but it was a future they would face together, built on foundations of truth rather than deception. There's one more thing I wanted to tell you, Thorvald said eventually. The Alliance Council has agreed to establish a new position, an official historian who will be responsible for ensuring that the true stories of our region's past are preserved for future generations. They want to offer the position to you. It was an unexpected honor, but one that felt perfectly suited to everything Astrid had learned about the importance of truth and the dangers of allowing lies to flourish in darkness. I would be honored to accept, she said, as they walked back toward the celebration together. Astrid felt the satisfaction that comes from seeing a difficult task through to completion, the mission that had begun with her father's desperate plan to place her inside. Magnus's household had evolved into something far greater, a transformation of the entire political landscape that would benefit countless people for generations to come. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important battles are fought not with swords and armies, but with patience, intelligence, and the quiet courage to stand for truth, even when it seems that lies have all the power. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from being the biggest or the strongest, but from being willing to appear weak while working toward justice. The girl who had once been mocked for her size had helped bring down a tyrant and build a better world. And that, she thought as she rejoined the celebration, was a story worth preserving for the ages.